Why power turns you evil faster than you imagine. Lord Acton, there's a moment subtle, almost invisible, when a person begins to change. It's not a dramatic transformation, not a Hollywood villain arc. It's quieter, more insidious. It starts with a decision that feels justified, a small compromise, a shortcut, a silence when you should have spoken. And before you know it, you're no longer who you thought you were. You're something else, something darker. This is the hidden truth behind Lord Acton's famous quote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." But what does that really mean? Is power inherently evil? Or does it simply unmask what was already there? Let me ask you something that might make you uncomfortable. If you had real, unchecked power, what would you do with it? Not in theory, but in practice. If no one could stop you, if you had no consequences, would you still act with the same integrity you claim to value today? Most people say yes, but history, psychology, and philosophy all point to a far more disturbing answer. Because power doesn't just change what you can do, it changes what you want to do. It rewires your mind. It distorts your perception of others. And worst of all, it inflates your sense of righteousness. You begin to believe that your actions, no matter how harmful, are justified because they're yours.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
We like to think that evil is obvious, and that tyranny wears a uniform, that the villain announces themselves with a sneer and a monologue. But the real danger is much more subtle. Evil often begins with good intentions. A leader wants to protect their people, and so they censor dissent. A parent wants to keep their child safe, and so they control every aspect of their life. A citizen wants justice, and so they justify cruelty against those they blame. In every case, power provides the leverage, and righteousness provides the excuse. And when those two forces combine, even ordinary people commit extraordinary harm. But why does this happen? Why does power have such a corrosive effect on the human soul? The answer lies in something deeply philosophical and deeply human. But you see, we are creatures of ego. We crave significance, control, and certainty. But power offers all three. When you have power, people listen to you. They obey you. They fear you. And that can feel intoxicating. It feeds the illusion that you are smarter, better, more deserving. Over time, you stop seeing others as equals and start seeing them as tools, obstacles, resources. And the moment you start dehumanizing others even subtly, you begin to lose your own humanity. Now think about this in your own life. Have you ever been in a position of power, even a small one, and felt that shift? Maybe you were in charge of a group project, or managing a team, or parenting a child. Did you notice how easy it was to silence others' opinions, to dismiss feedback, to make decisions without consulting anyone? Those moments are the seeds of corruption, and they grow fast, because power isolates you. It distances you from consequences. It shelters you from criticism, and the more power you gain, the fewer people are willing to tell you the truth. Until one day you stop hearing the truth at all, and you start believing your own myth. Here's a terrifying question. What if the very traits that help us gain power are the same traits that make us unfit to hold it? And think about it. To climb the ladder, you often need ambition, confidence, and a willingness to bend the rules. But once you're at the top, those same traits can turn against you. Ambition becomes greed. Confidence becomes arrogance. Rule bending becomes law breaking. It's not that power changes you, it amplifies you. It magnifies what was already inside. And if you haven't done the inner work, if you haven't confronted your own shadows, then power will expose them to the world. But this isn't just about politics or leadership. This is about all of us, because we all have power in some domain of life, over someone or something, and how we handle that power reveals who we truly are. So here's another question. Are you using your power to elevate others or to elevate yourself? That one simple distinction can change everything. Because the people who use power wisely are the ones who remain humble. They remember their own flaws. They invite criticism. They ask questions instead of giving orders. They see leadership not as dominance, but as service. And yet, even the best among us can fall. Because the path to corruption isn't paved with evil choices, it's paved with unconscious ones. That's what makes it so dangerous. It doesn't feel like evil. It feels like necessity, like logic, like progress. But one day you wake up and realize you're no longer serving your principles, you're serving your ego. That moment of realization is rare. Most people never see it. They surround themselves with yes men, they silence their conscience, and they keep climbing until there's nothing left to climb and no one left to trust. So the real question isn't just whether power corrupts. It's this: can you possess power without being possessed by it? That's the challenge. That's the test. And in the next part, we're going to explore exactly what happens inside the human mind when power takes hold, and how quickly it can turn even the noblest heart into something unrecognizable. The psychology of the throne, how power rewires your brain and destroys empathy. When we think about power, we often imagine it as something external, a title, a role, then the position in the hierarchy. But the truth is, power is not just something we hold, it's something that holds us. It doesn't just sit in your hand, it seeps into your mind. And once it enters, it begins to change things, your thoughts, your perceptions, your emotions. This isn't just poetic imagery, it's supported by psychology, neuroscience, and history. Power, quite literally, rewires your brain, and the first thing it shuts off is empathy. Let's unpack that. Empathy is the ability to feel what someone else feels, to see the world through their eyes, to recognize their experience as real and valid. It's the glue of humanity. Without empathy, we become isolated islands of self-interest. But here's the disturbing part. Studies have shown that as a person's sense of power increases, their capacity for empathy decreases. Not because they become evil overnight, but because they stop needing other people emotionally. Power creates a psychological distance. You start to see others less as individuals and more as functions, tools, obstacles, assets. And once that shift happens, your moral compass begins to spin. Think about how this plays out in everyday life. A manager who used to value their team starts seeing them as resources. A politician stops seeing voters as human beings and starts seeing them as numbers, polls, demographics. A parent loses sight of their child's inner world and starts managing them like a project. In every case, the same thing is happening. The more control you feel, the less you listen. The less you question yourself. The less you feel the need to understand. Because power tells you that you already know best. Why bother feeling what others feel when you already believe your judgment is superior? This is where things get terrifyingly real. Because once empathy begins to erode, You stop seeing people as ends in themselves and start seeing them as means to your goals. That's when justice becomes tyranny in disguise. That's when leadership becomes control. When you tell yourself, I know what's best for everyone, and stop asking whether they agree. That's when the villain origin story begins, not with malice, but with certainty. The unshakable belief that you are right, and that they don't understand, that you must do what's necessary. And if some people suffer in the process, well, that's just collateral damage, a small price for a greater good. But what's the greater good, really? Who defines it? Who decides what sacrifices are justified? Here's where power becomes most dangerous, when it disguises selfishness as virtue. When a ruler says, I'm doing this for the people, but secretly fears losing control. When a tech CEO says, we're changing the world, but quietly crushes dissent and hoards billions. When a pastor says, it's about saving souls, but uses their influence to manipulate, shame, or exploit. This is how power seduces even the well-intentioned, not by tempting them with evil, but by convincing them they are the good. And once you believe that, anything becomes permissible. Here's the paradox: the more power you have, the more you need empathy. But the more power you gain, the harder it becomes to feel it. That's the trap. That's why so many powerful people become disconnected, paranoid, isolated. They don't just lose touch with others, they lose touch with themselves. They stop hearing the internal signals that once kept them grounded: doubt, guilt, humility. And without those signals, you can't self-correct. You can't recognize when you've gone too far, because in your mind you haven't. And no one around you will challenge that, because they're afraid, or because they've been conditioned not to. And so, the spiral continues. A person with a good heart gains power. Power rewires their mind. Empathy fades. Certainty grows. Feedback disappears. And eventually, they become the very thing they once despised. Not because they wanted to, but because they didn't know how to stop it. So ask yourself, how do you keep your humanity intact when you have the power to ignore it? That's not a hypothetical question. Because we all hold power somewhere in our relationships, our jobs, our communities. And every day, we choose whether to use that power to dominate or to serve, to silence or to listen, to elevate ourselves or to elevate others. In the next part, we're going to explore real-world examples of how even well-meaning leaders fell into this psychological trap, and how the few who resisted it managed to keep their souls intact. The goal isn't just to understand power, it's to master it before it masters you. From saints to tyrants, why good people become the monsters they once fought. It's the most haunting transformation of all. Watching someone who once stood for justice, compassion, and truth slowly become the very force they once vowed to destroy. This isn't just a tragic fall from grace, it's a recurring pattern through history, psychology, and even our personal lives. And the most terrifying part, it usually begins with good intentions, the desire to make things better, and to protect others, to fix what's broken. But somewhere along the way, the mission mutates, the cause becomes a crusade, and the person becomes unrecognizable even to themselves. We see this in political revolutions all the time. The rebel leader who fights tyranny only to become a tyrant once they seize power. The reformer who begins by challenging injustice and ends by justifying oppression in the name of the greater good. It's an ancient paradox The very people who are most passionate about justice are often the ones most susceptible to committing injustice once they're in charge. And why? Because moral certainty is a double-edged sword. It gives you courage, but it also blinds you to your own potential for harm. You stop questioning your motives. You start believing that your ends justify any means. And before long, you're doing things you once condemned, only now you tell yourself it's different. Let's take a real-world example. Consider the French Revolution. It began with cries for liberty, equality, and the end of monarchy. The people rose up against oppression. They demanded dignity. But within just a few years, the revolution devolved into the reign of terror. Thousands were executed by guillotine in the name of freedom. Why? Because the revolutionaries believed so deeply in their cause that anyone who opposed it even slightly was seen as an enemy of the people. Dissent became treason. Mercy became weakness. And Robespierre, one of the revolution's most passionate advocates for justice, became its butcher. He didn't begin as a monster. He became one by believing too deeply in his own righteousness. But this isn't just about grand historical tragedies. It happens in everyday life too. A teacher who starts their career wanting to inspire students becomes a bitter authoritarian, doling out punishments instead of wisdom. A manager who wants to empower their team becomes controlling, micromanaging every decision. A parent who just wants to protect their child becomes overbearing, smothering their growth. In each case, the arc is the same. Good intentions curdle into control. Love becomes fear. And power, once acquired, becomes a justification for behavior that once would have felt unthinkable. The shift is gradual, almost invisible. That's what makes it so dangerous. No one wakes up and says, "Today I will become a tyrant." Instead, they say, "I don't have time to explain," or "This is for your own good," or "If I don't take control, everything will fall apart." These sound like reasonable statements. But they're warning signs. They signal the erosion of empathy, the hardening of the heart, the rise of the ego. And if they go unexamined, they become the building blocks of monstrous behavior layer by layer, brick by brick. So how do we stop this transformation before it begins? The answer lies in humility, in the constant recognition that even our best intentions can become corrupted if we're not vigilant. It's in surrounding ourselves with people who challenge us, who question our decisions, who remind us that we are fallible. It's in staying connected to the very people we serve, not as abstractions, but as human beings with fears, hopes, and voices that matter. And most of all, it's in remembering that power is not a right, it's a responsibility, a burden. A test of character that most fail not because they are evil, but because they stop asking the right questions. So here's a question for you. What would it take for you to become the villain in your own story? Not because you want to, but because you stop noticing. Where is that line for you? At what point does protecting your dream become controlling others? At what point does defending your values become silencing those who disagree? These are not abstract thought experiments. These are the questions that separate saints from tyrants. Because the difference isn't in how they start, it's in how deeply they examine themselves along the way. In the next part, we'll bring everything together. We'll explore how to wield power without being consumed by it, how to remain human while holding influence, and how to create a world where power serves people, but not the other way around. The final test: how to hold power without losing your soul. If power is a flame, Then holding it is a test of whether you can carry fire without setting yourself and everyone around you on fire. That's the final challenge. Not whether you can acquire power, but whether you can survive it. Whether you can remain yourself in the face of endless praise, silence in the face of criticism, and the seductive comfort of being surrounded only by people who agree with you. Because power doesn't just test your leadership, it tests your soul. It reveals your deepest beliefs, your hidden wounds, your unspoken fears, and it asks, will you remain awake? Or will you fall asleep inside your own importance? We often assume that to resist corruption, one must be extraordinarily strong. But it's not strength that keeps you from being consumed by power, it's awareness, self-awareness, moral awareness, the awareness that you, like anyone else, are vulnerable to delusion. That no matter how noble your cause, no matter how pure your mission, the moment you stop questioning yourself is the moment you begin betraying everything you stood for. And the tragedy is, you won't feel it happening. That's the curse of power. It numbs the very senses that would warn you of your own drift. So how do we stay awake? How do we pass the final test? First, we must build systems around us that force accountability, not as a punishment, but as protection. Power isolates, so we must deliberately surround ourselves with people who challenge us, who tell us when we're out of line, who care more about truth than our approval. These people are rare. Treasure them, invite them, give them permission to speak, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's difficult. A leader without critics is a leader already lost. Second, we must practice humility not as a performance, but as a discipline. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. It's remembering that your position does not make you better than anyone else. That every decision you make ripples into the lives of people you may never see. That leadership is not about being the loudest voice in the room, but the one who listens the most deeply. Humility is the anchor that keeps power from drifting into ego. Third, we must reconnect constantly with the why behind our power. Why are we doing this? Who are we serving? What pain are we trying to ease? What future are we trying to build? And are we still on that path, or have we started serving ourselves instead of others? This isn't a question you ask once, it's a question you ask every day. Because the mission will always compete with the mirror. Are you still serving your purpose, or are you just protecting your image? And finally, we must stay connected to the people. Not just the ones who praise us, but the ones who challenge us, who struggle, who suffer under the weight of the systems we influence. Power becomes toxic when it becomes abstract. When decisions are made in boardrooms with no windows. When policies are written without ever looking into the eyes of those affected. If you want to keep your soul, stay close to the ground. Walk among the people your power touches. Let their voices shape you. Let their pain remind you why you're here. Because in the end, power is not evil, it is simply a force. Like fire, it can warm or it can destroy. It can illuminate or it can blind. The difference lies not in the power itself, but in the one who wields it. And that's you. That's me. That's all of us, in every room where we're given influence, in every moment when someone looks to us for guidance, justice, or care. So here's the final question. When power finds you, and it will you become more of yourself or less? Will it corrupt you or refine you? Will you carry it to elevate others or to elevate yourself? Because in the end, Lord Acton wasn't just warning us about kings and emperors. He was warning us about ourselves. And now that you know, the test has already begun.